There's a green scar in the heart of the world's largest desert that refuses to heal. You look at the pyramids and you see monuments to human genius. But the real story of Egypt isn't about greatness. It's about desperation. It's about a species pushed to the edge of extinction, herded into a narrow golden cage by forces beyond their control and what they built to survive it. This is not just the story of ancient Egypt. This is the story of how climate refugees invented the nation state, created the world's first god-kings, and built mountains of stone to prove they could outlast time itself. This is the biography of a superpower born in a trap. Welcome to Chronicles Reborn. Let's go back to the very beginning, before the desert, before the pharaohs, before Egypt even existed. 10,000 years ago, North Africa looked nothing like it does today. The Sahara was green. There were vast freshwater lakes, some the size of modern European nations. There were forests, wetlands, and grasslands teeming with wildlife. Scattered across this paradise, nomadic tribes moved freely across a horizon that stretched into infinity. They answered to no king. They paid no taxes. They followed the rains and the herds. This was the African humid period, and for thousands of years, it was as close to paradise as our species had ever found. Then, around 5,500 BCE, the Earth tilted. Not literally, but in its orbital cycle around the sun, something subtle shifted. The summer monsoon rains that watered North Africa began to fail, first slowly, then catastrophically. The lakes begin to shrink. The grasslands brown and crack. A wall of sand advancing from the north begins to swallow everything. Entire ecosystems collapse in a geological instant. The people who had lived in this paradise for thousands of years now faced a terrible choice: die in the expanding desert or follow the water. And the water led them to a single narrow valley carved by a river that defied everything around it. A river so impossible it seemed like a miracle. A river called the Nile. They didn't choose Egypt. Egypt was chosen for them. And what awaited them in that swampy, flood-prone valley was not paradise, it was a trap that would take thousands of years to understand. Imagine arriving here as a climate refugee. Behind you, a desert that is actively consuming your homeland. Before you, a volatile, swampy, unpredictable river that floods without warning and recedes without pattern. This is not a gentle paradise. The Nile of 5000 BCE is wild and violent. Hippos capsize boats, crocodiles patrol the shallows, and the annual flood, when it comes, can erase everything you've built overnight. But here is the miracle hidden inside the catastrophe. Every year, when the flood recedes, it leaves behind something extraordinary. A layer of rich black silt, some of the most fertile soil on Earth, deposited across the floodplain like a gift from the river itself. The Egyptians called it the Black Land. It was narrow, rarely more than a few miles wide on each bank, but it was extraordinarily productive. One farmer working this black soil could feed 10 people. Beyond the Black Land lay the Red Land, the desert that had driven them here, the desert that would always be waiting. This geography created something psychologically powerful. The Nile people were surrounded on all sides. They couldn't go back, they couldn't easily leave. They had to make this work. That pressure, that desperation is what forged one of the most innovative civilizations in human history. But first, they had to unify. And that would require something the world had never seen before: a single ruler commanding an entire nation. By 3300 BCE, Egypt was not one country. It was two worlds, and they were on a collision course. In the north lay Lower Egypt, the vast marshy delta where the Nile split into dozens of channels before pouring into the Mediterranean. This was a landscape of fishing villages, wetlands, and scattered rural communities, prosperous but fragmented. In the south lay Upper Egypt, a different world entirely. Narrow canyon valleys carved by the ancient river, rocky desert cliffs rising on both sides. And here, something extraordinary was happening. City-states were rising. Hierakonpolis, Nakada, Thinis. These weren't just settlements, they were power centers, fueled by long-distance trade with distant cultures like Mesopotamia. Caravans of goods moving along the Nile. Exotic materials, lapis, lazuli, gold, cedar wood, flowing into these emerging cities. Wealth creates ambition, and ambition creates war. Over generations, through a combination of alliances, marriages, and brutal military conquest, these southern city-states began to merge. Historians call this era Dynasty 0, the Shadow Kings, leaders who carved their names into history before history even had a name for them. These were warrior kings who understood something fundamental. If you controlled the Nile, you controlled everything that moved along it. And if you controlled what moved, you controlled who ate. The Southern Confederacy, the Thinite coalition, turned its eyes northward toward the Delta, toward the Mediterranean gateway, toward conquest. But to unite this divided land permanently, you needed more than an army, you needed a story, you needed a legend. You needed one man whose victory could be frozen in stone for all eternity. Around 3100 BCE, a warrior king from the south made his move. His name was Narmer. And what he accomplished, or claimed to accomplish, changed the trajectory of human civilization. The Narmer Palette is one of the most remarkable objects ever discovered. Found in the ruins of Hierakonpolis, it is, in the words of archaeologists, the world's first masterpiece of political propaganda. A flat ceremonial stone, roughly 25 inches tall, carved on both sides with scenes of absolute triumph. On one face, Narmer towers over a kneeling enemy, mace raised, about to deliver the killing blow. The falcon god Horus holds a rope attached to a human head emerging from the earth, symbolizing the conquered north. On the other face, Narmer marches in procession past rows of decapitated enemies. Two mythical beasts, their long necks intertwined, represent the forced union of two formerly separate worlds. The message was not subtle, it was absolute. The unification of the two lands was not a negotiation, it was a conquest. To lock this victory in place permanently, Narmer made a decision of extraordinary strategic intelligence. He founded a new capital, not in the north, not in the south, but exactly at the boundary between them, a city called Memphis, known as the White Walls. Think of Memphis as a cork in a bottle, sitting at the precise point where Upper Egypt's narrow valley meets the Delta's vast spread. Memphis controlled every grain of wheat, every merchant, every soldier, every message moving between the two halves of the country. The cage was closed. Egypt was one nation. And its first pharaoh now faced the most difficult challenge any ruler has ever faced. How do you make millions of people believe it's natural to obey one man? The answer changed the world. The revolution of the mind. Military conquest is a blunt instrument. Armies win battles, but they can't force 1 million people to genuinely accept their place in a hierarchy. For that, you need something far more powerful than a sword. You need an idea. The idea the early pharaohs invented was called Ma'at, and it was one of the most sophisticated acts of political engineering in all of human history. Ma'at wasn't just a law, it was the divine personification of cosmic order itself: truth, justice, balance, harmony. The ancient Egyptians believed the universe was in a constant struggle against chaos, and the only thing standing between an ordered world and total cosmic collapse? The pharaoh. The king was no longer a man who happened to hold power. He was the living incarnation of Horus, the falcon god of the sky. He was the only bridge between the heavens and the earth. Without him performing the correct ritual, the sun would not rise, the Nile would not flood, crops would fail, the world would end. This wasn't just theology, this was the cleverest tax system ever devised. Because when paying taxes is the same as keeping the universe from collapsing when refusing to contribute grain to the royal granary, is literally a cosmic crime. You don't need armies to collect revenue. People pay willingly, enthusiastically. To manage this divine machine, the pharaohs created something new: the scribe class, an elite bureaucracy that developed the world's first systematic tax assessment, a process called the following of Horus. Using stone instruments called nilometers placed at strategic points along the river, these scribes measured the flood levels with precision.
an extraordinary 90 years, a global climate event struck. Scientists call it the 4.2 kiloyear event. The monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands, which fed the Nile's annual flood, failed for decades. The flood doesn't come. The black silt that should be renewing the fields never arrives. The irrigation channels become graveyards, and the royal granaries, already hollowed out by decades of temple exemptions and no-mark corruption, have nothing to offer. Famine swept the Nile Valley. Desperate people broke into food stores. The social contract of Ma'at, the guarantee that the pharaoh would protect his people, shattered. If the pharaoh was the living god who kept the Nile flooding, and the Nile had stopped flooding, what exactly was the pharaoh? The answer triggered the first intermediate period, a brutal century of civil war, regional fragmentation, and the complete collapse of the centralized Egyptian state. But from the ruins, a new force was rising from an obscure town in the south, a town called Thebes. After a century of civil war, a king named Mentuhotep II emerged from Thebes and did what every ruler before him had done. He conquered. He crushed his rivals. He reunited the two lands. But the Egypt that emerged from this reunification was psychologically different from the one that had collapsed. The myth of the infallible god-king had been broken. Everyone had seen what happened when the pharaoh failed to deliver. Everyone remembered the famine. The new pharaohs understood they needed a different justification for their power. They invented one, the king as shepherd. The pharaoh is still divine, but now he holds a shepherd's crook, not as a symbol of dominance, but as a symbol of care. The royal iconography changes from "I will crush you" to "I will protect you." The king's legitimacy now rests explicitly on his ability to provide for his people, not merely on his divine lineage. This shift produced something remarkable, the democratization of the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, eternal life was a royal monopoly. Only pharaohs and their inner circle could access the spells and rituals that guaranteed resurrection. In the Middle Kingdom, these texts began appearing in the tombs of ordinary people. For the first time, any citizen with a moral life had a shot at immortality. Religion became a social contract, not just a tool of control. Haunted by memories of famine, the memory of the 4.2 kiloyear event was still vivid. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs made a brilliant hydraulic gamble. They transformed the Faiyum Depression, a natural low-lying area west of the Nile, into an enormous artificial reservoir. Engineers dug channels connecting the Nile to this natural basin. When floods were high, excess water flowed in and was stored. When floods were low, that stored water could be released. Egypt had invented the world's first national water savings account. It was an engineering achievement that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years, and it worked. Egypt stabilized, the granaries filled, trade routes reopened. Nubian gold flowed north through a chain of high-technology fortresses built along the southern Nile. But prosperity, as Egypt was about to learn again, is a magnet for danger.
The Bronze Age collapse is one of history's great mysteries and one of its great disasters. Within a period of roughly 50 years, virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simply ceased to exist. The Mycenaean Greeks, gone. The Hittite Empire collapsed overnight. The Syrian city-states, abandoned. The palace economies of Canaan, destroyed. We still don't know exactly why. The evidence points to a perfect storm: prolonged drought, famine, internal rebellions, systems collapse, and cutting through all of it like a sword, waves of migrants and raiders the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. Egypt was the only major power to survive, but it did so barely. Pharaoh Ramesses III fought the last great defensive battle of the Pharaonic era. When the Sea Peoples attempted to invade the Delta by sea, he didn't meet them in open water. He drew them into the narrow channels of the Delta, channels he knew, channels his sailors had navigated their whole lives, and ambushed their fleet. The sea battle is recorded in vivid relief carvings at Medinet Habu. It is one of the most dramatic military scenes in ancient art. Egypt won, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The treasury was empty. International trade, the lifeblood of the state economy, had collapsed along with every trading partner Egypt had ever had. The first recorded labor strike in history
happened at this moment when the tomb builders of Deir el-Medina simply stopped working because their grain rations hadn't been paid. The great machine of Ma'at had failed to feed its own workers. After the Bronze Age collapse, Egypt never recovered its former dominance. What followed was a long, remarkable sunset. The Third Intermediate Period saw the country splinter again. The high priest of Amun accumulated so much power, he effectively became a parallel pharaoh in the south, while military generals ruled the north. Egypt became a country with two governments, and then three, and then more. From the south came an unexpected savior, the kingdom of Kush, the Nubian civilization Egypt had once dominated and exploited for its gold, had absorbed Egyptian culture so deeply that its kings saw themselves as the true guardians of Ma'at. The Black Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty marched north with a holy war's conviction, reunified the country, and sparked a genuine cultural renaissance. They were followed by a predator they couldn't match, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians fought with iron, Egypt fought with bronze. In 663 BCE, the unthinkable occurred. The Assyrians sacked Thebes, the holiest city in Egypt, the city of Amun, the city that had birthed the new kingdom. Sacred obelisks were dragged away as trophies. Egypt's response, in its late period, was remarkable. The Saite kings hired Greek mercenaries, reopened trade with the Mediterranean world, and launched a deliberate cultural revival. Artists copying the styles of pyramid builders from 2,000 years before. It was historical cosplay as political strategy. By dressing in the robes of their glorious ancestors, the Saite pharaohs claimed their legitimacy. But the world had changed too much. In 525 BCE, the Persian Empire arrived and turned Egypt into a province. Egypt made one last stand, 60 years of independence under the 30th dynasty, before the Persians returned in 343 BCE. The last native pharaoh, Nectanebo II, fled south into Nubia. He would be the last Egyptian to ever rule the Nile. When Alexander the Great arrived a decade later, the Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator. He was crowned pharaoh. He trekked to the desert oracle at Siwa and was declared the son of Amun. But for the next 2,000 years, the Nile would be ruled by foreigners.
The Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek rulers who followed Alexander, perfected the centralized Egyptian state with corporate efficiency. They replaced barter with coins. They imposed monopolies on everything from cooking oil to beer. They built magnificent temples. They invented a hybrid god, Serapis, designed specifically to bridge the gap between Greek Zeus and Egyptian Osiris. Their most brilliant ruler was their last, Cleopatra VII. Unlike every Ptolemy before her, she learned the Egyptian language. She presented herself as the living incarnation of the goddess Isis. Her political gamble, aligning with Rome's two most powerful men, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, was the last great play of pharaonic statecraft. It failed at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. With Antony's fleet destroyed and his armies crumbling, Cleopatra chose death over the humiliation of a Roman triumph. Egypt became the personal property of the Emperor Augustus. The story of Egypt is the story of a civilization that began as a desperate act of survival and ended as the longest-lasting political entity in human history. 3,000 years, 30 dynasties, hundreds of pharaohs, countless collapses and rebirths. The Nile's ecological trap, the narrow black ribbon of fertile land surrounded by killing desert, forced Egypt's people to develop extraordinary levels of organization, innovation, and collective belief. The cage created the civilization. The desperation created the genius. The pyramids still stand. The hieroglyphics can be read again. The mummies breathe in climate-controlled museum cases, and the Nile still flows, though now controlled by a concrete dam rather than the prayers of priests. Ancient Egypt didn't just survive the sands of time, it outlasted empires, invasions, collapses, and 3,500 years of foreign rule, and still fills us with awe. That is the legacy of the civilization born in a cage, and that is why we keep coming back to it. If you found this reconstruction extraordinary, subscribe to Chronicles Reborn and tell us in the comments, which ancient civilization should we bring back to life next? I'll see you in the next era.